Give me everything in the drawer. Stay calm and nobody gets hurt. 9 words. Block letters, ballpoint pen, folded twice down the middle so the crease had gone soft from handling. A teller named Ruth Ann Pelzer read those words on the morning of March 14, 1971, at the counter of Farmers State Bank in Wymore, Nebraska. She looked up. On the other side of her window stood a man in a full-length butcher's apron, hands empty, voice barely above a whisper when he finally spoke at all. He asked her, politely, to hurry. The apron itself was stained across the chest, and one sleeve, not fresh blood, something older, something that had dried into the weave years before that morning. Ruth Ann noticed the smell before she noticed the note. A faint copper and tallow smell she'd later say reminded her of her uncle's smokehouse. The bank had 4 employees on duty that morning. Ruth Ann at the counter, a loan officer in the back office, a part-time bookkeeper, and the branch manager, who was out sick. Nobody else in the building even realized a robbery was underway until the man had already walked out the front door and turned north, on foot, toward a stand of cottonwoods at the edge of town. He never touched a gun. He never wore a mask that anyone could later describe with any confidence. He worked alone, every single time, in a stained white apron like he'd just walked off a killing floor. And over the next 11 years, he humiliated the Federal Bureau of Investigation 19 times across 5 states without leaving behind one usable fingerprint. The Bureau eventually gave him a name for the file, Ted. Nobody knew if it was real. Field agents who chased him and lost him 7 separate times by the Bureau's own count called him something else entirely. They called him the Ghost. And what almost nobody outside a locked cabinet in the Kansas City field office knew, until the file was finally opened to researchers a few years ago, is that the Ghost had a system. He'd read every bank robbery bulletin the Bureau ever circulated, the internal ones meant to teach agents how robbers get caught, and he'd turned every single mistake on that list into a rule he broke never. By the time that cabinet was unsealed, the file itself had grown to 4 thick volumes, water-stained at the corners from a basement flood in 1979, held together with rubber bands that had gone brittle, and snapped the moment researchers tried to lift the first folder free. 14 different agents had signed off on some portion of the case across its life. Only 2 of them ever stayed with it long enough to matter. This is the reconstruction of how a former slaughterhouse foreman from a town most Americans couldn't find on a map ran a one-man crime wave through the Farm Belt for over a decade, and how 2 agents who refused to let the file die finally closed it with a stained $20 bill and a coffee can buried behind a barn. Wymore wasn't his first stop by accident. It was small. It had one road in and out that mattered, and it had a bank with a single teller working the morning shift. He'd apparently scouted it for weeks. Neighbors later told agents they remembered a man in a gray sedan parked near the grain elevator on 3 separate mornings, never getting out, never doing anything worth a phone call. That was the whole method in miniature. Patience so total it looked like nothing at all. The Gage County Sheriff's Office was the first to respond that morning, arriving 9 minutes after Ruth Ann tripped the silent alarm under the counter, a delay that would later be flagged as unacceptably slow for a town Wymore's size, though nobody could explain exactly why. Deputies dusted the counter, the door frame, and the single chair the robber had never sat in, and came up with nothing usable. Not because he'd worn gloves, tellers were certain he hadn't, but because whatever oil or residue had been on his hands left prints too smeared and shallow to lift clean. A local FBI resident agent, working out of a one-room office in Beatrice 20 minutes away, arrived within the hour and took over the scene formally, though there was almost nothing left to process. The gray sedan the neighbors remembered was gone from the grain elevator lot by the time anyone thought to look for it. No plate number, no make or model beyond gray, and probably a Ford. It was the first entry in what would become, over 11 years, a long list of details that were almost enough. He took $6,240 that morning. Not a huge number, even by 1971 standards, but it was the apron that stuck with Ruth Ann Pelzer for the rest of her life. She told investigators more than once that it was the calmest bank robbery anyone could imagine, and that the calm was somehow worse than if he'd screamed. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, in 1971, had bigger things on its mind than a single low-dollar heist in a town of 900 people. Domestic bombings were up. Bank robbery, as a category of crime, was treated almost as a nuisance category, compared to organized crime and counterintelligence. A robbery under $10,000, with no shots fired and no injuries, went into a drawer, got a case number, and waited for a lead that, in most instances, never came. Nobody in Washington was thinking about Wymore, Nebraska in the spring of 1971. That would change, slowly, and then all at once, as the same quiet man in the same apron started showing up in towns nobody could connect to each other. Fairbury, then a town in Kansas, then one in Iowa. Each robbery small enough to look isolated. Together, they weren't. Special Agent Walter Hines picked up the Wymore file almost by accident. He'd been with the Bureau's Kansas City field office since 1961, working almost exclusively bank robbery cases, the unglamorous end of the job that produced arrests but rarely headlines. Hines was 51 years old in 1971, a heavy-set man with a habit of tapping a pencil eraser against his front teeth while he read, and colleagues remembered him as the kind of agent who kept files other people had given up on. He'd grown up in rural Missouri himself, the son of a hardware store owner, and agents who worked alongside him in Kansas City said he had a peculiar habit of driving the actual route between two robbery towns on his own time, unpaid, just to understand what a man behind the wheel would have seen. His wife, Doris Hines, later told a Bureau oral history project that he sometimes fell asleep with case photographs spread across the bed, and that she'd learned, over the years, not to move them before morning. He noticed the second robbery before anyone officially connected it to the first. August 1971, 5 months after Wymore, a bank in Table Rock, Nebraska, 41 miles away. Same note style, same apron. Same total silence from the robber beyond the minimum words required to get cash into a bag. Hines pulled both files, laid them side by side on his desk, and wrote a memo suggesting the two robberies might be the work of the same man. Before writing that memo, Hines drove out to Table Rock himself and sat across a kitchen table from the teller who'd been robbed, a woman named Carol Vosberg, 26 years old, who'd been working the bank counter for exactly 4 months. She told him the same thing Ruth Ann Pelzer had told investigators in Wymore, almost word for word, without ever having spoken to her, that the man never raised his voice, that he thanked her when she finished counting out the drawer, and that his calm was the part she couldn't stop thinking about at night. Vosberg quit the bank 3 weeks later and never worked behind a teller's counter again. Hines kept her statement paperclipped to the front of his private file for the next 5 years. A small reminder, he told Marsh much later, of what the file actually cost people, underneath all the numbers. His supervisor's response, according to the memo trail later pulled from the archive, was 2 sentences long. It said the pattern was interesting, but not worth reassigning manpower over. 2 small-town robberies, 6 months apart, under a combined $15,000. Hines kept the memo anyway. He started his own private file, separate from the official case numbers, and gave it a name nobody had authorized, the apron file. That's the detail that stuck with me going through this case. Not the money, not even the 11 years. It's that one field agent, working alone with no backing from headquarters, decided a pattern was real 2 robberies in, based on nothing but a note style and a piece of clothing, and turned out to be exactly right, while everyone above him was certain there was nothing there. By the end of 1972, there were 5 robberies in the file. Nebraska, twice more. Kansas, once. A town in northern Missouri. Total take across all 5, $38,900. Hines had also started noticing something else, something that would matter far more later. The robber never hit 2 banks in the same season back to back. Spring, then a gap. Late summer, then a gap again into the following spring. It read, to Hines, like a man with somewhere else to be most of the year. A job. A season that mattered more to him than robbing banks did. He was right. Nobody would know how right for another 9 years. The robberies from 1971 through 1973 shared a signature so exact it became its own kind of evidence. Same folded note, always block letters, always some version of the same 9 words. Same apron, laundered clean enough that fiber analysis picked up traces of bleach but nothing else useful. Same calm voice, described independently by 7 different tellers across 4 states, as polite, a word that came up again and again in witness statements. An unsettling word to hear about an armed robbery, even though no gun was ever actually seen. That's the part most people get wrong about this case when they hear the outline secondhand. They assume there had to be a weapon, because that's what a bank robbery is supposed to look like. There wasn't. Not once, across 19 robberies, did a single teller report seeing a firearm. The note implied violence. The calm implied he could carry it out. Nobody ever tested whether he actually would, because nobody ever refused him. By January 1973, Hines had 5 robberies, 1 working theory, and 0 support from Kansas City leadership to formally reopen the cases as connected. He requested access to a 6th robbery report that had just come in from a small bank outside Marysville, Kansas. The report included something new, a partial license plate, called in by a farmer who'd seen a gray sedan idling near the bank 40 minutes before the robbery. It was the first physical lead in 2 years. Hines thought, for a moment, that the case might finally break open. It didn't. Not for another 3 years. And not before the robber walked into a 7th bank in a town nobody on the task force had ever heard of, wearing an apron that, by then, 3 different states' worth of tellers could describe in their sleep. The partial plate led nowhere useful within days. It matched a farm vehicle registration from a family 2 counties away who'd sold the sedan at auction 8 months earlier, and the paper trail on the buyer simply stopped. A dead end that would turn out to be one of at least 4 separate times the robber came within arm's reach of identification and slipped through on nothing but bad luck working in his favor. Hines logged it, filed it, and kept going, because that was the entire job at this point. Keep going. The robberies through 1974 and 1975 added a wrinkle that made the case both more solvable and more maddening at the same time. He started mailing postcards. The first one arrived at the Kansas City field office 9 days after a robbery in Falls City, Nebraska, in June 1974. Standard postcard, a generic image of a wheat field on the front, postmarked from a town 60 miles from the robbery site. On the back, in the same block letters from the demand notes, was a single line, "Tell the tellers I said thank you." No signature, no threat, just that. Document examiners at the Bureau's Washington laboratory spent nearly 3 weeks on that first postcard, running the ink through chromatography, measuring letter forms against a national handwriting database that, in 1974, was still mostly index cards in file drawers rather than anything searchable by machine. They found nothing. No match, no distinguishing pen defect, no watermark on the cardstock beyond what 10,000 drugstores across 6 states carried on a rotating rack. The postcard, like everything else about the man, had been chosen specifically because it told them everything and nothing at once. Hines read the postcard 4 times before he understood what he was looking at. This wasn't a man trying to disappear. This was a man who wanted the Bureau to know exactly who they were chasing, while making absolutely certain they could never catch him doing it. The postcards became part of the pattern. Not every robbery, roughly every 3rd one, mailed from a town that was never the robbery site, and never, as far as agents could determine, anywhere the man actually lived. He was driving somewhere else entirely, just to mail a piece of paper that told the Bureau nothing, except that he was watching them fail to catch him. One postcard, mailed in October 1975, after a robbery in a town called Hiawatha, read differently than the others. The words were friendly, almost warm, which made the message underneath them land harder. It said, "You're reading my bulletins better than your own agents are." That single line told Hines something the Bureau had not considered until that moment. This man wasn't just avoiding capture, he was studying them. Specifically, he was studying the internal FBI bulletins on how bank robbers typically get caught, the documents meant to train agents, not warn criminals, and he was using them as a personal checklist of mistakes never to make. There is a line in the case file, written by Hines himself in a supplemental report dated November 1975, that reads almost like something out of a novel. He wrote that the Bureau was, in effect, training its own most successful adversary, one confidential bulletin at a time. By 1976, the file had grown to 11 robberies, 3 states, and a name nobody could confirm. Total take across all 11 jobs, $187,300. Still not the kind of number that moved resources in Washington on its own. What moved resources, finally, was embarrassment. 2 attempted intercepts in 1975 alone had failed within minutes of the robber's departure. Once by 11 minutes, once by a margin so close that an agent later told a colleague he'd seen dust still settling on a gravel road the robber had turned down. That was near miss number 6, though nobody was counting yet in quite those terms. The 7th came 4 months later outside a bank in Falls City again, the same town as the first postcard robbery. And it was the one that finally forced Kansas City leadership to reconsider whether nuisance was still the right word for this file. Agents had, for the first time, staked out a bank based on a predictive pattern rather than a tip. Hines had noticed the robber tended to return to towns he'd already hit roughly every 3 years, likely because memories fade and staffing changes. Falls City fit the window. Agents sat on the bank for 6 days. The stakeout had put 2 agents in a parked delivery van across the street, rotating 6-hour shifts, with a third agent posted inside a hardware store 2 doors down, who could see the bank's side entrance through a gap in a window display of garden tools. Radio checks ran every 20 minutes. On the 7th day, the motel tip came in secondhand through a local deputy who swore it was worth immediate follow-up, and the agent in charge of the operation made the call to pull both mobile units for what he expected would be a 40-minute detour. It stretched to 2 hours because the motel manager wasn't on site when they arrived, and they waited for him rather than force entry on a soft tip. By the time the van pulled back into position across from the bank, the robbery had already been called in for 11 minutes. He robbed the bank in those 2 hours. That failure, more than any success, is what got Hines the resources he'd been asking for since 1971. Embarrassment moves budgets faster than patience ever does. In April 1976, the Kansas City field office formally opened a dedicated task force, and Hines, after 5 years of running a private file nobody wanted, finally had backup. 1 partner. Not a task force in the sense of dozens of agents. 2 people, a shared desk, and a mandate that still wasn't quite as strong as Hines wanted it to be. His new partner was Special Agent Lucille Marsh, 29 years old, transferred in from the Cincinnati field office the year before. Marsh had joined the Bureau in 1973, 2 years after policy changes finally opened the FBI Academy to female agents, and she'd built a reputation fast, not through field work, but through an unusual habit of treating case files the way an actuary treats mortality tables. She looked for numbers other agents skimmed past. Her first week in Kansas City, according to 2 agents interviewed decades later for an internal retrospective, a senior supervisor introduced her to the rest of the bank robbery squad by joking that she'd been sent to make sure everyone filed their expense reports correctly. Marsh didn't correct him in the room. She asked for the apron file by name 3 days later, having heard about it secondhand from a clerk in records, and read all 5 case files twice before she ever mentioned it to Hines directly. Put yourself in her position for a second. 29 years old, 5 years into a career that most of her male colleagues still treated as a temporary experiment, handed a file that 11 other agents had already touched and failed to close. She could have played it safe. Instead, within her first month on the case, she requested something nobody had thought to pull before: weather records, harvest calendars, and county fair schedules for every town within 100 miles of each robbery site. Hines thought it was a strange request. He didn't stop her. What Marsh found, over the following 6 weeks, reshaped the entire investigation. The robbers' getaway routes weren't random. They changed by season, and they changed in a way that only made sense if the man doing the driving knew farm country from the inside. In spring and early summer, he favored routes along recently graded gravel roads, the kind county crews resurfaced every April, because fresh gravel doesn't hold tire impressions the way packed dirt does. In fall, during harvest, he switched to routes that ran past active combine traffic, using the noise and dust and general chaos of harvest season as cover, timing robberies to weeks when a dozen unfamiliar trucks on a rural road wouldn't draw a second look from anyone. The Bureau finally put a name to the pattern that autumn. In an internal profile memo Marsh drafted herself. It described a suspect who understood agricultural cycles at a level consistent with someone who had worked farm-adjacent labor for most of his life, who robbed with a discipline that suggested industrial training rather than criminal experience, and who displayed, in the memo's own words, an intimate, almost professional knowledge of livestock and meat processing operations. The apron wasn't a costume. It was a habit from a real job, worn so long it had become part of how the man moved through the world. That profile, more than any tip or any postcard, is what eventually led Marsh toward the piece of the puzzle that would take years to pay off: the money itself. 19 robberies were coming. Somewhere, all that cash had to go. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. A man robbing banks purely for money should have been spending it, moving it, showing some sign of a changed lifestyle. He showed none. Neighbors near his eventual home described a modest life: an old truck, a small house that needed paint. If he was stealing over $400,000 across a decade, where was it going? Marsh's theory, one she pushed for 2 full years before anyone above her took it seriously, was county fairs. Rural county fairs across the Midwest run heavy cash economies. Livestock sales, raffle tickets, concession stands, entry fees, all of it moving in bills that get counted by volunteers, not banks, and often deposited in batches days or weeks later with no serial number tracking at all. A man who understood that system, who'd grown up around 4-H auctions and county fair livestock rings, would know exactly how to feed stolen cash into that river a little at a time and watch it disappear into legitimate transactions before it ever touched a federal reporting threshold. It took Marsh until 1979 to get approval to test the theory, and testing it meant something tedious and unglamorous. Cross-referencing fair attendance and livestock auction records across 6 counties against the dates and locations of the robberies. Weeks of work, no warrant, no funding for surveillance, just index cards and a growing headache. What strikes us about this stretch of the case is how little of it looks like the movies. There's no shootout here, no dramatic chase down a highway. It's 2 agents and, for years, mostly one of them, doing arithmetic by hand, because nobody would authorize anything more expensive on a suspect they still couldn't name. That patience is the actual story. The chase wasn't fast. It was slow, in a way that would have broken most investigators' will years before it broke this case open. By 1978, the total stood at 15 robberies. Total take, $312,750. The Bureau's internal estimate of investigative hours spent on the case, factoring in Hines and Marsh's combined salaries and expenses over 7 years, had already crossed the total dollar amount stolen. Some agents in the Kansas City office, according to Marsh's own later interviews, openly questioned whether the case was worth the resources at all. A robber who'd never hurt anyone, never fired a shot, and stolen a total sum that wouldn't cover a single major bank fraud case elsewhere in the Bureau's workload. Here's the take that'll probably get us some pushback. We think the Bureau was, for most of the 1970s, chasing this case for the wrong reason. Not because Ted the Butcher deserved to walk free. He didn't. But because the institutional motivation, by 1978, had curdled from public safety into something closer to wounded pride. 19 successful robberies against one agency is embarrassing in a way that has nothing to do with actual harm done, and there's a real argument that resources spent chasing a nonviolent thief for 11 years might have done more good pointed somewhere else. The Bureau never saw it that way. Hines and Marsh certainly didn't. But it's worth sitting with, because it shapes everything about how doggedly this case got pursued, compared to cases with actual victims left broken by violence. What do you think? Does 11 years of federal manpower on a man who never hurt anyone strike you as diligence, or as an agency that couldn't stand to lose? By the time the robber hit his 18th bank, in a town called Pawnee City, Nebraska, in June 1980, the arithmetic had become its own kind of headline inside the Bureau. 19 banks in 11 years, once the count reached its final total, across a tract of 5 states, nobody could draw a clean line through on a map. Total stolen, $412,600. Not $1 of it recovered. Not one print on file. Not one confirmed sighting of his face that 2 witnesses agreed on. Marsh's county fair theory finally got traction in the spring of 1980. Not because anyone above her changed their mind about its merit, but because of an obstacle nobody could have planned for. A winter storm in February 1980 buried 3 counties in northeast Nebraska under snow for 6 straight days, closing roads Hines and Marsh needed to canvass auction houses in person. Their surveillance window on 2 suspected fairground cash operations collapsed entirely. 6 days of dead time on a case that had already eaten 9 years. They didn't have the luxury of waiting the storm out and picking the plan back up unchanged. Marsh used the 6 days differently. Snowed into the field office, she went back through every fair and auction record she'd gathered and cross-referenced them a second time, this time against seasonal cattle price fluctuations, a variable nobody had thought to check. What she found reframed the entire theory. The robber wasn't just laundering cash through fairs generally. He was doing it specifically at livestock auctions, buying and reselling cattle at a small loss, using the auction system itself as a cash-cleaning mechanism, because nobody questions why a man walks away from a livestock sale a few $100s lighter than he walked in. That refinement, born entirely out of 6 lost days that should have set the investigation back, ended up being the detail that broke the case wide open 2 years later. There's a myth about this kind of investigation, that the big break always comes from a dramatic stakeout or a lucky tip from a nervous accomplice. Most people assume that. The evidence in this file tells a different story. The break came from an agent snowed into an office with nothing to do but read the same numbers twice. Marsh presented her livestock auction theory formally to the Kansas City special agent in charge in April 1980. He approved a narrow surveillance budget, 6 weeks, 4 counties, on the condition that it produced something concrete, or the task force would be reduced to part-time status. 6 weeks came and went. Nothing. The robber, as he'd done for 9 years running, seemed to know exactly how much scrutiny was safe and simply didn't sell any cattle during that window. The task force was reduced to part-time in June 1980. Hines, 59 years old by then, and eligible for retirement within 2 years, was told to split his hours between the case and a backlog of unrelated robbery files. It looked, for the first time since 1976, like the file might quietly die of institutional exhaustion rather than ever actually close. What nobody in that meeting knew was that the robber had just made the first real mistake of his entire career, 4 months earlier, in a robbery that on its surface looked exactly like the other 18. The 19th robbery happened in Mars, Iowa, on the morning of September 9, 1981. Same note, same apron, same calm voice. What was different, and what the teller on duty that morning, a woman named Doris Kellerman, didn't mention in her initial statement, because she didn't think it mattered, was that the bank had recently upgraded its cash drawer security. A die pack, standard countermeasure equipment by the late 1970s, had been placed in the outer bundle of 20s without staff fully retraining on the new drawer layout. Doris handed it over along with the rest, without realizing it was there. The pack activated roughly 90 seconds after he left the bank, based on the standard delay mechanism used at the time. By the time it triggered, he was already off the main road. Already, agents would later determine, following his established seasonal harvest traffic route. He likely felt the heat and smelled the chemical smoke from inside the bag. Mars police, first on scene, found a faint red haze still hanging in the parking lot when they arrived, and traced a scorched trail of orange-red powder for almost 60 yards along the shoulder of the road before it thinned out into nothing. It was the closest any responding officer had come, in 11 years, to standing on ground the robber had actually walked across within minutes of a robbery. They bagged soil samples from 3 points along that trail, samples that would eventually confirm the die pack had detonated at low intensity, likely due to age, which was the only reason Dietrich hadn't simply pulled over and burned the entire bundle on the spot, something later analysis suggested he'd been trained, by the FBI's own public bulletins on die pack countermeasures, to consider doing. He also, and this is the detail that took the case another full year to surface, apparently didn't realize how thoroughly the die had marked the bills underneath the ones that had visibly burst. He didn't dump the money, that was his mistake. Whether out of overconfidence or simple unwillingness to abandon nearly $9,400 in cash after 11 years of careful discipline, he kept it, let it sit, and eventually spent it slowly, the same way he'd spent everything else. A portion of that stained cash entered circulation through exactly the channel Marsh had theorized 2 years earlier, a livestock sale. So here is the second question. This case had been building toward the whole time. The one underneath, who is Ted? If he'd studied every FBI bulletin closely enough to avoid 19 robberies worth of standard mistakes, how did a man that careful not know his own money was marked? That question sat unanswered for almost a full year, and the answer, when it finally came, turned out to explain something about him that nobody on the task force had considered at all. The task force stayed part-time through the rest of 1981 and into 1982. Marsh kept her livestock auction surveillance running at a reduced pace, mostly on her own initiative, checking auction house cash-in reports from 4 counties whenever she had a spare afternoon. It was tedious, unrewarded work, the kind that doesn't show up in performance reviews and doesn't win anyone a commendation. On September 7, 1982, almost exactly 1 year after the Mars robbery, an auction house employee at the Cherokee County Livestock Auction in Cherokee, Iowa, noticed something odd about a $20 bill handed over during a heifer purchase. A faint reddish stain, mostly washed out but still visible under direct light, ran across Andrew Jackson's portrait. The employee, who had, as it happened, attended a regional bank security briefing 8 months earlier that mentioned die pack residue as something tellers and cash handlers should watch for, set the bill aside and called the county sheriff's office out of simple caution. That single $20 bill sat in a sheriff's evidence drawer for 6 days before anyone connected it to a federal case. The auction house employee who'd first noticed the stain, a 19-year-old cashier named Denise Ostrander, working her first full-time job out of high school, almost threw the bill back into general circulation without a second thought. She said later that the only reason she didn't was that the security briefing had specifically mentioned reddish as the color to watch for, a word that had stuck with her because it seemed like such an oddly specific detail for a training handout to include. It was Marsh, running her routine check of auction house reports, who spotted the sheriff's incident log entry and recognized what she was looking at within minutes. The bill's serial number matched a batch reported stolen from the Lamar's robbery 1 year and 2 days earlier. Marsh drove to the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office that same afternoon. What she found waiting for her there was a receipt, handwritten, from the September 7 heifer sale. A name. An address roughly 19 miles outside Onawa, Iowa, on a stretch of gravel road that ran past exactly the kind of recently graded surface Marsh had flagged years earlier as part of the robber's seasonal route pattern. The name on the receipt was Eleanor Dietrich, not Ted, not a man at all, on paper, at that first moment. Marsh's initial read, and it's worth sitting with how close this case came to going sideways one final time, was that Eleanor Dietrich might herself be an accomplice, or worse, might have no connection to the robberies at all, in which case the bill was a dead end and the trail would go cold yet again, the way it had 7 times before. Hines pulled the county property records that evening. The Dietrich farmhouse had been registered to Harold Dietrich and his wife Eleanor since 1962. Harold Dietrich, according to a 1968 layoff notice recovered from state unemployment records, had worked for 14 years as a floor foreman at a meatpacking plant near Sioux City before the plant mechanized its processing line and cut nearly 40 jobs, his included. A meatpacking foreman, a man who would have handled a butcher's apron every working day of his adult life until the year 1968, 3 years before the first robbery in Wymore. Hines and Marsh requested a surveillance warrant that night. It took 11 days to secure, partly due to a magistrate who wanted stronger corroboration than a single stained bill and a plausible employment history, and those 11 days were, by both agents' later accounts, the longest of the entire 11-year investigation. Every day of delay was another day Harold Dietrich might notice the bill was gone, might read something in a local paper, might simply decide, after 11 years of discipline, to disappear the same way he'd always planned to if it ever came to this. He didn't. He had no idea he'd been found. Surveillance began on September 25, 1982. Agents watched the farmhouse from a rented property half a mile down the road, using binoculars, and, for the first time in this case's history, a small handheld surveillance camera the Bureau had only recently begun issuing to field offices. What they documented over the following week matched Marsh's profile almost exactly. A man in his mid-40s, quiet, methodical, spending most daylight hours tending a small cattle operation behind the house. No visible wealth. No sign, from the outside, of anything but an ordinary farm. On October 1st, 1982, agents watched Harold Dietrich load 3 sealed coffee cans into the bed of his truck and drive them roughly 200 yards to a spot behind an old grain bin, where he buried them and covered the disturbed earth with loose straw. He'd done this, agents would later confirm through soil analysis, at least 4 separate times over the preceding decade. A man doesn't bury money he's planning to spend soon. He buries money he's planning to leave behind for someone else, or money he's simply stopped needing. That single afternoon told Hines and Marsh something neither of them said aloud until much later. This wasn't a man still actively planning a 20th robbery. This looked, more than anything else in 11 years of evidence, like a man quietly closing out a life's work. The raid came at dawn on October 2nd, 1982. 6 agents, a county sheriff's deputy, and a warrant covering the farmhouse, the barn, and the surrounding property. 2 agents took position at the tree line north of the house before sunrise, watching for movement through the kitchen window. A third and fourth covered the barn and the gravel drive, blocking the only vehicle route out. The county deputy stayed back with the cars, radio in hand, in case Dietrich bolted toward the fields on foot. Something nobody genuinely expected from a 47-year-old man with no history of violence, but something the operational plan accounted for anyway. 11 years of caution built into a single morning. Hines led the approach personally, despite being weeks from mandatory retirement eligibility, a decision his supervisors questioned, and he refused to explain beyond saying he'd earned it. Harold Dietrich answered his own front door in a bathrobe, unarmed, and according to every agent present, said nothing for nearly 30 seconds after Hines identified himself and stated the reason for the warrant. Then he said 4 words that closed 11 years of federal frustration in a single sentence. "I figured it'd be you." Not a denial, not a demand for a lawyer, not yet. Just recognition, and something close to relief. Agents recovered $61,400 in cash from 3 buried coffee cans behind the grain bin, along with a butcher's apron, folded and stored in a cedar chest that matched fiber and wear patterns from at least 11 of the 19 robbery scenes. They also recovered something nobody had anticipated: a small stack of unsent postcards, at least 6 of them, written and dated but never mailed, apparently prepared in advance for robberies that had never happened. Evidence, investigators concluded, that Dietrich had at least considered continuing the spree, even after the Lamar's die-pack close call should have warned him off entirely. And they finally got an answer to the question that had sat underneath this entire case since Ruth Ann Pelzer first read a folded note in 1971. Who was Ted? 11 years compressed into one morning of questioning finally produced the answer, and it was almost anticlimactic in how simple it turned out to be. Harold Dietrich's full legal name was Harold Theodore Dietrich. Theodore, shortened by his own mother to Ted when he was a boy growing up outside Sioux City in the 1940s, a nickname his wife Eleanor still used at home decades later. He hadn't invented an alias at all. He'd signed every postcard, for 9 years, with his own real middle name, hiding in the single place no federal agent would ever think to look: total honesty. Marsh, in an interview years afterward, said that detail bothered her more than almost anything else in the case. 11 years of profiling, of studying handwriting and postmark patterns and seasonal travel routes, and the man's actual identity had been sitting in plain sight on every postcard he ever mailed, signed in his own hand, the whole time. Dietrich was arraigned in federal court in Sioux City on October 14, 1982, facing 19 counts of bank robbery. He pleaded guilty to all 19 counts on January 11, 1983, in an arrangement that avoided a trial in exchange for full cooperation locating any remaining hidden funds. Investigators recovered an additional $14,200 from a 4th cache Dietrich led them to personally, a location Marsh noted he seemed almost relieved to give up, as though the burden of remembering where it all was had outlasted whatever satisfaction the money itself had once provided. He was sentenced on March 3, 1983, to 22 years in federal prison, a sentence that accounted for the number and duration of the offenses while crediting his nonviolent record and full cooperation. He served just under 11 years, the same length of time he'd spent robbing banks, before dying of heart failure in a federal medical facility in Rochester, Minnesota, in February 1994, at the age of 57. Eleanor Dietrich was never charged. Investigators found no evidence she knew the source of the money, beyond a general sense that her husband handled cattle sales privately and kept his own books, a detail that matched a marriage built, by every account gathered afterward, on a division of household duties that predated the robberies entirely, and simply never changed. Unpopular opinion, and we know this one will split the comments. 22 years for 19 robberies totaling just over $400,000, with no injuries and no weapon ever displayed, is not obviously too lenient. It's also not obviously proportionate to 11 years of deliberate federal manpower and a small town's worth of tellers left rattled for the rest of their lives. Ruth Ann Pelzer, in a follow-up interview conducted decades after that first robbery, said she still, to that day, couldn't walk past a butcher's counter at a grocery store without her pulse climbing. That's a cost the sentencing math never quite captures. Special Agent Walter Hines retired in December 1982, 2 months after the arrest, closing out a 21-year bureau career with the case that had defined most of it. He gave exactly one interview about the investigation before his death, in 2003, and in it he said the thing he remembered most wasn't the raid or the arrest. It was 1975, standing in an empty office at 2 a.m., alone, reading the same 11 case files for what must have been the 100th time, certain nobody else in the bureau believed the connection was real, and deciding to keep the file open anyway. Special Agent Lucille Marsh stayed with the bureau for another 18 years, eventually training incoming analysts in exactly the kind of cross-referential pattern work that broke this case. Work that at the time she started it had no formal name inside the Bureau at all. She's cited, in later internal FBI training materials, as one of the earliest practitioners of what would eventually become standard analytical methodology for long-running serial crime investigations. The case that almost got shelved for good in June 1980 became, within a decade, a teaching model for how patient, unglamorous data work closes cases that dramatic pursuit never could. Here's what this case tells us about the era it came from, and about the Bureau specifically. For most of the 1970s, this file survived only because two individual agents refused to let institutional indifference kill it. There was no unit built for cases like this one. No dedicated behavioral science division ready to profile a rural bank robber with the resources it would take to catch him properly. Just one agent's private notebook, and later, one analyst's stubborn insistence on checking numbers other people had already decided didn't matter. If either of them had transferred out, or burned out, or simply agreed with their supervisors that the case wasn't worth the hours, there's a real chance Harold Dietrich dies in that farmhouse in 1994 as an ordinary retired farmer, and Ted the Butcher stays an open file forever. We cut a few details from this story for time, including the full contents of those 6 unmailed postcards Dietrich never sent. One of them, dated just weeks before the raid, was addressed not to the FBI, but to nobody in particular. If you want to hear what it said, let us know in the comments, and we'll cover it properly in a follow-up. 11 years, 19 banks, 5 states, $412,600, and in the end, the man who beat the Bureau's own training manual for a decade was undone by a heifer sale and a piece of technology that had been sitting in bank drawers across the country for years before it ever caught up with him. If this is the kind of case file you want more of, subscribe, because we're pulling the next one straight from an archive that only opened to researchers last year, and it involves an armored truck heist the Bureau still won't fully explain.